A black executive traveling incognito in casual attire steps into the first-class check-in line, ready for a routine flight. But within moments, her experience takes a shocking turn. A dismissive airline staff member questions her ticket and humiliates her in front of passengers. What they didn't realize, she wasn't just another passenger, she was their new CEO. Just 10 minutes later, the tables were turned, and what unfolded next stunned everyone in the terminal. Stay with me. This is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories about resilience and justice inspire you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The airport hummed with a quiet urgency, the kind that swelled just beneath the surface of everyday life, where people moved with purpose but carried hidden burdens. Renee Parker stood in the first-class check-in line, her leather suitcase balanced beside her. It was the kind of bag that spoke not of extravagance, but of durability and time, an object worn smooth by years of persistent use. She adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, her movements precise, measured. The line moved slowly. Ahead, Karen Thompson, the supervisor, her name stitched in sharp, authoritative letters on her badge, managed the counter with the clipped efficiency of someone who wielded power in the smallest of spaces. Her tone was brisk, her eyes scanning passengers like items on a conveyor belt. Beside her stood Mike Jacobs, who leaned lazily against the counter, exchanging smirks with Karen between their whispered asides. Renee had seen this dynamic before. She could feel it. An almost physical undercurrent that pulsed through certain spaces, a quiet signal that some were welcome, others merely tolerated. Her shoulders tensed as Karen's sharp bark cut through the terminal. Next, the line shuffled forward. A businessman in a crisp suit strode to the counter, and Karen's demeanor softened noticeably. Her voice took on an artificial sweetness, her smile almost saccharine. The interaction was quick, efficient, and courteous. The businessman nodded his thanks and moved on. Renee took a step forward, her turn approaching. Next, Karen called again, her voice now devoid of the warmth it had just held. Renee walked forward, calm but aware of the shift. Karen's gaze flickered over her, her expression tightening imperceptibly. "Yes?" Karen said, her tone sharp. "Good morning," Renee said, her voice steady. "I'd like to check on the status of my flight. There seems to be a delay." "Ticket?" Karen interrupted, holding out a hand but avoiding eye contact. Renee handed over her first-class boarding pass. Karen glanced at it, then at Renee, her lips curling into a faint sneer. "This is a first-class ticket," Karen said, as though stating the obvious was an accusation. "That's correct," Renee replied evenly. Karen exchanged a glance with Mike, who chuckled under his breath. "You sure you're in the right line?" Mike asked, his tone teetering between politeness and condescension. "I'm quite sure," Renee said, her voice steady but firmer now. Karen sighed loudly, scanning the ticket with a theatrical slowness that suggested Renee's presence was an imposition. "You'll have to wait," Karen said curtly, handing back the ticket without a word of apology. "We're busy." Renee's jaw tightened, but she didn't react. Instead, she stepped aside and waited, watching as Karen and Mike continued their routine. A man in a hoodie approached the counter next, clutching an oversized backpack. "Wrong line," Karen said immediately, barely looking at him. "Economy is over there. I'm in first class," the man said quietly, holding up his phone to display his ticket. Karen's eyes flickered to the screen, then back to the man. "Fine," she said, her tone begrudging as she waved him forward. Mike smirked. "Must have been a lottery win," he muttered, loud enough for Karen to hear. Renee's gaze remained steady, though her fingers curled slightly around the handle of her suitcase. She had encountered this before: the dismissals, the quiet mockery, the undercurrent of judgment that swirled in places where civility wore a thin, brittle mask. She took a seat on a nearby bench, her back straight, her movements deliberate. From there, she watched. Karen's demeanor shifted with each passenger, her tone polite and accommodating when addressing those who fit a certain mold and dismissive toward those who didn't. And then there was Emily, a younger staff member stationed at a side desk, whose nervous glances at Karen betrayed her unease. Emily worked diligently, her hands trembling slightly as she typed on the keyboard. Unlike Karen, she met passengers' eyes and offered genuine smiles. But each time Karen barked an order or snapped at someone, Emily shrank a little further into herself. Renee observed it all, the unspoken dynamics unfolding like a quiet play. She thought of the countless people who must have passed through this terminal before her. Subjected to the same subtle dismissals. The same quiet indignities. They weren't yelling slurs. No, it was far more insidious than that. It was in the raised eyebrow. The clipped tone. The way Karen's lips tightened when she saw someone like Renee step forward. It was in the silence of others, the passengers who looked away. The staff who stayed quiet. Complicit in their passivity. Renee traced her boarding pass with her fingers. The words first class embossed in bold letters. She smiled faintly, the edges of her lips curling upward with a quiet resolve. They didn't know who she was yet. But they would. The hum of the terminal continued around her. A tapestry of movement and sound. But Renee remained still. She wasn't just waiting for her flight. She was waiting for her moment. The terminal grew louder as more passengers streamed in, their voices blending with the muffled roar of jets outside. From her seat near the counter, Renee Parker observed the choreography of the morning rush. Her calm presence contrasting with the frenetic energy around her. She had learned long ago that quiet attention was often the most powerful tool in a world that thrived on distraction. Karen Thompson's voice rose above the din again, sharp and commanding. "I said next," she barked, waving forward a woman juggling two small children and a worn carry-on bag. The woman approached, frazzled, her toddler whining loudly while the older child clutched her leg. Karen's smile was brittle, forced. "Ma'am, you'll need to get your children under control," she said, her tone tight with impatience. "I am sorry," the woman stammered, shifting her weight as she tried to calm her toddler. "It's just been along." Karen cut her off with a raised hand. "We're busy. You need to be ready when you get here." The mother flushed with embarrassment, her movements fumbling as she searched for her tickets. Renee's gaze softened as she watched, the scene striking a familiar chord. How easily people like Karen could strip dignity from someone who was already struggling. All while hiding behind the pretense of procedure. As Karen dismissed the woman with a sigh, Mike Jacobs chuckled and leaned closer to mutter something. Whatever it was, it made Karen smirk. Renee noticed Emily flinch slightly, her hands pausing over her keyboard. The young woman looked over at Karen. Her expression caught somewhere between frustration and fear. But she said nothing. The next passenger was a tall black man in his late 30s. Dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie. His quiet demeanor seemed to disarm Karen. But only briefly. "Where's your ticket?" she asked briskly, her eyes narrowing as though expecting an excuse. The man handed it over silently. His shoulders set. Karen's eyes scanned the ticket, then darted up to him. "This says first class," she said, her voice heavy with skepticism. "Yes," he replied, his tone calm but firm. Karen's lips pursed into a thin line. "You're in the right place," she said curtly, her reluctance palpable. She handed the ticket back and waved him forward. Mike leaned toward her again, grinning. "Guess it's first class day for everyone," he murmured. The man turned slightly, his eyes catching Renee's. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement of a shared experience. Karen and Mike continued their work, their behavior predictable now, a pattern of condescension and derision that shifted with each passenger. A young couple in designer outfits received polite smiles and swift service. An elderly Asian woman, struggling with limited English, was met with clipped instructions and impatient gestures. Renee's fingers tightened on the armrest of her seat, her composure steady but her resolve hardening. She thought of the paradox at the heart of moments like these, the belief that prejudice was a relic of the past, something people no longer spoke of in polite company. And yet here it was, alive and thriving, woven into the smallest interactions. It wasn't loud or violent. Not here. It was insidious, cloaked in bureaucracy and delivered with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. A sudden commotion broke her thoughts. An older white man in a rumpled suit was gesturing animatedly at Karen. "You're telling me my seat is gone?" he demanded, his voice rising. "I booked this weeks ago." Karen's response was cool, detached. "Sir, as I explained, the flight is overbooked. There's nothing I can do." "Overbooked?" he repeated, incredulous. "I paid for that seat." Karen shrugged, her indifference grating against his anger. "You'll have to wait for the next available flight." The man muttered something under his breath and stormed off, leaving Karen to roll her eyes dramatically. "Some people just don't understand how airlines work," she said loudly, glancing at Mike, who snorted in agreement. Renee inhaled deeply, letting the moment settle in her mind. It wasn't just Karen or Mike. She realized it was the unspoken rules that governed spaces like these, rules that allowed some to be dismissed, others ignored, and a select few elevated without question. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, drawing her attention. She glanced at the screen. A message from her assistant. "Jasmine, all set for your arrival. Mr. Bennett is excited to introduce you to the team." Renee's lips curved into a faint smile as she typed a quick reply. "I'm observing the team already. Enlightening. We'll update soon." Sliding the phone back into her pocket, she stood and smoothed her blazer. The next passenger in line, a middle-aged black woman with salt and pepper hair, stepped forward, holding a neatly folded boarding pass. "Good morning," she said warmly. Karen's eyes flickered over her, her expression cool. "Ticket?" she said flatly. The woman handed it over, her smile faltering as Karen examined it. Karen said, dragging the moment out. "You're in the right line." "Barely." The woman's face fell, her confidence visibly shaken. Karen handed back the ticket without another word, already calling for the next passenger. Renee stepped forward, her posture poised, her movements deliberate. Karen looked up, her annoyance flashing briefly before she masked it. "Yes," she said, her tone sharp. "I'd like to confirm the status of my flight," Renee said, her voice calm but firm. Karen sighed heavily, as though the request were an unbearable burden. "Like I told you before," she said, her tone laced with irritation. "You'll have to wait." Renee tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "And like I told you before," she replied evenly. "I've been waiting." Karen's jaw tightened, and Mike shifted uncomfortably beside her. For the first time that morning, a flicker of uncertainty passed between them. Renee let the silence linger for a moment before stepping back, her smile faint but knowing. They didn't realize it yet, but the dynamics in the room were beginning to shift. The invisible divide was becoming visible, and the power they thought they held was starting to fray at the edges. The minutes dragged on, the airport a living tide of movement and sound. Passengers hurried past with their rolling suitcases and travel pillows. Announcements echoed over the intercom, and the faint scent of coffee wafted from the nearby cafe. Renee sat silently on the bench, her gaze fixed on the counter. She was still, but her thoughts churned, sharper than the sharpest blade. Karen Thompson and Mike Jacobs continued their routine, their smug indifference now tinged with an edge of unease. Renee's steady presence had unnerved them, though neither would admit it. Karen barked commands with more force now, her movements brisk and rigid, while Mike's once lazy posture straightened slightly. They sensed something in Renee, though they couldn't name it, a quiet authority that unsettled their carefully balanced game of power. A new passenger approached the counter, a black woman wearing a bright headscarf and a long floral dress. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her hands clasped tightly around her boarding pass. Karen's eyes swept over her, narrowing slightly before the usual impatience crept into her tone. "Ticket," Karen demanded, snatching it before the woman could fully extend her hand. The woman hesitated, taken aback by Karen's brusqueness. "I'm traveling to Chicago," she said softly. "I just need to." "Your bag is overweight," Karen interrupted, her voice cold. She motioned toward the scale without even looking up. "You'll need to pay a fee before I can check it in." "But the woman began, her voice trembling. "No exceptions," Karen said curtly, her gaze shifting to the next person in line. The woman fumbled with her purse, pulling out her wallet and counting her bills with trembling fingers. She looked up at Karen, who tapped her nails against the counter, her impatience palpable. "I'm short by $5, the woman said, her voice barely audible. Karen sighed dramatically. "Then you'll need to step aside until you have the full amount," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. Renee watched the scene unfold, her chest tightening. She had seen this before, not in this exact place, not with these exact people, but in countless other forms. It was the unspoken rules of power, the quiet dismissal of those deemed unworthy of respect, the way an institution could grind someone down to their smallest self. The woman stepped back, clutching her bag and her dignity as best she could. Her face was a mask of quiet humiliation, but her eyes betrayed her hurt. Renee rose from her seat, her movements deliberate. She approached the counter, stepping beside the woman. "I'll cover the difference," Renee said, her voice calm but firm. Karen looked up, startled, and for a moment, her mask of indifference slipped. "That's not necessary," she said quickly, as though the act of kindness itself was an affront. "It's no trouble," Renee replied evenly, placing the money on the counter. She turned to the woman and offered a small smile. "Safe travels," she said gently. The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. She clutched her bag tighter and walked away, her steps steady but her shoulders still heavy. Karen's jaw tightened as she processed the transaction, her movements sharp with suppressed irritation. "Next," she barked, her voice louder than before, as though trying to reassert her authority. Another passenger stepped forward, this one a young Latina mother holding a baby in her arms. Karen's tone shifted immediately, her words clipped and impatient as she directed the woman to consolidate her bags. Renee stepped back to her bench, but her attention remained fixed on the counter. She was no longer just an observer. The divide between passive observation and quiet action had been crossed, and there was no going back. The terminal seemed to grow louder as the challenges intensified, the air thick with tension that most passengers didn't even notice. But Renee noticed. She saw it in the subtle shifts of body language, the nervous glances of the younger staff, and the way Karen's demeanor became more brittle with each passing moment. A group of teenagers approached the counter next, their backpacks slung over their shoulders and their laughter loud and carefree. Karen's tone lightened, almost flirtatious, as she processed their tickets with a practiced smile. "Enjoy your trip," she said sweetly, waving them on. The juxtaposition was glaring, each interaction a thread in the fabric of a pattern Renee had long known but never stopped feeling. The weight of it pressed against her ribs, a familiar ache she carried as quietly as her boarding pass. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Jasmine. "Everything okay? Need me to adjust your schedule?" Renee typed back quickly. "No adjustments. Everything is proceeding exactly as it needs to." Sliding the phone into her pocket, Renee straightened her blazer and crossed one leg over the other. Her thoughts sharpened, each observation adding to the mosaic she was piecing together. This wasn't just about Karen or Mike. It was about something larger, something that had been built brick by brick over years. Decades, centuries. Karen and Mike were merely symptoms of a deeper illness, one that thrived in silence and complicity. And Renee was no stranger to that silence. She had lived within it, navigated around it, and, when necessary, shattered it. The next passenger in line was an elderly white man with a cane. Karen's tone softened immediately, her body language shifting to accommodate him. "Of course, sir," she said sweetly. "Let me take care of that for you." Renee's lips pressed into a thin line. The inconsistency wasn't just maddening, it was deliberate. People like Karen knew exactly what they were doing. They just didn't expect anyone to challenge them. The terminal lights glinted off the glass walls, casting long shadows across the floor. Renee watched those shadows shift and thought of all the people who had stood in her place before, those who had waited, endured, and walked away with their dignity bruised but intact. But Renee wasn't here to walk away. She leaned forward, her hands clasped together as she waited. The rhythm of the terminal continued around her, but the weight of the moment was beginning to shift. And as the minutes ticked by, Renee knew one thing with certainty: the quiet tension that filled the air wouldn't stay quiet for long. The terminal felt heavier now, as though the weight of what lingered beneath the surface had begun to seep into the air itself. Renee Parker sat upright on the bench, her hands resting on her lap, her gaze steady as the scene at the counter continued to unfold. She had seen this rhythm play out before, but today, there was a particular sharpness to it, a reminder that what was happening here wasn't new, only newly witnessed. Karen Thompson's voice sliced through the hum of the terminal again, her tone rigid as she addressed the next passenger. A middle-aged black man in a tailored suit. His presence radiated quiet authority. But Karen greeted him with the same air of suspicion she had used on others like him. "Ticket?" she said, holding out her hand as though the word itself were a command. The man handed it over, his expression neutral but his jaw tight. Karen scanned the ticket, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're late," she said brusquely. "I'm here well before boarding," the man replied, his voice measured. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "You should have checked in earlier," she said, her tone accusatory. I'll see if we can still accommodate you." The man blinked, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "I don't understand. This is a first-class ticket. And I've arrived within the check-in window." Karen's eyes flicked to Mike, who shrugged, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Policy's policy," Karen said dismissively. "Wait over there, and I'll let you know." The man stepped aside, his composure intact but his frustration evident in the tightness of his shoulders. Renee's chest ached with familiarity. She knew that particular dismissal. That erosion of dignity that didn't come with shouting or slurs but with a quiet, calculated undermining. The next passenger, a young white woman in athleisure wear, approached the counter. Karen's demeanor changed instantly, her voice brightening. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" The woman smiled and handed over her ticket. Karen processed it quickly, her tone warm and accommodating. "Everything looks great. Enjoy your flight," Karen said, waving the woman on with a saccharine smile. The contrast was jarring, but it was also deliberate. Karen's approach wasn't just inconsistency, it was a pattern. One built on unspoken hierarchies that she enforced with practiced ease. Renee's phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her attention momentarily. It was another message from Jasmine. "Any updates? Everyone's looking forward to the meeting." Renee responded swiftly. "Updates soon. There's much to discuss." Sliding her phone back into her blazer, Renee rose from the bench, her movements slow and deliberate. She approached the counter just as an elderly black woman with silver braids stepped forward. The woman leaned on a cane, her expression warm but tired. She handed her boarding pass to Karen, who glanced at it with a barely concealed sigh. "Your bag is oversized," Karen said flatly, pointing to the carry-on at the woman's feet. The elderly woman blinked, her brow furrowing. "I've used this bag for years, and it's never been an issue," she said softly. "Well, it's an issue now," Karen replied, crossing her arms. "You'll need to pay the fee or leave it behind." The woman's shoulders sagged slightly, her grip tightening on her cane. "Is there any way?" "No exceptions," Karen interrupted. Renee stepped forward then, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made Karen look up sharply. "I'll handle it," Renee said, her eyes meeting Karen's. Karen hesitated, her mask of authority faltering. "That won't be necessary," she began, but Renee held her gaze. Unflinching. "It is necessary," Renee said evenly. Karen pursed her lips but said nothing as Renee turned to the elderly woman. "Let me take care of this for you," Renee said gently, her voice softening. The woman looked at Renee, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. Renee paid the fee without another word, her movements precise and controlled. Karen watched, her expression a mix of annoyance and unease. "Next," Karen called abruptly, trying to reassert her dominance. As Renee stepped aside, she noticed Emily, the younger staff member, watching from her station. Emily's eyes held something new, a spark of recognition, perhaps even hope. But it wasn't just Emily who noticed. Passengers nearby had begun to watch, their curiosity piqued by the quiet shift in the air. Karen and Mike, for all their bravado, seemed less confident now, their voices quieter, their movements more restrained. The terminal lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Renee felt the weight of the moment settling around her, each interaction adding another layer to the story unfolding before her. The dynamics were shifting, slowly but unmistakably, and though Karen and Mike didn't realize it yet, their control over this small domain was slipping. Renee returned to her bench, her posture impeccable, her presence commanding without effort. She wasn't here to demand respect or force change. She was here to bear witness, to act when necessary, and to remind those around her subtly but unmistakably that the quiet indignities of the world didn't go unnoticed. The cracks in the mask were growing, and Renee could see clearly what lay beneath. The question now was not whether the truth would surface, but how those who clung to their illusions of power would react when it did. The air in the terminal thickened as the morning wore on, the tension stretching taut like a wire ready to snap. Renee Parker sat upright, her posture unyielding, her gaze fixed on the counter where Karen Thompson and Mike Jacobs held court. Their authority, so casually wielded, began to waver under the weight of what they didn't yet understand. They were being watched. Not just by Renee but by others who had started to notice the cracks in their facade. Another passenger stepped forward, a young black man wearing a faded college sweatshirt and carrying a duffel bag. He looked nervous, his movements hesitant as he handed over his boarding pass. Karen barely glanced at it before thrusting it back at him. "You're in the wrong line," she said curtly, pointing toward the economy check-in area. "No, I'm not," he said, his voice steady but low. "This is a first-class ticket." Karen's eyes narrowed as she snatched the ticket back and scanned it. Her lips pursed into a thin line. "You barely made the weight limit on your bag," she said, her tone laced with accusation. "Next time, be more careful." The man blinked, his composure slipping under her scrutiny. "I thank you," he said finally, his words faltering as he took his ticket and stepped aside. Karen turned to Mike, who muttered something that drew a chuckle from her. The man paused briefly, his eyes flickering toward them, then moved on, his shoulders slumping slightly. Renee felt her jaw tighten, a familiar heat rising in her chest. It wasn't just the dismissal, it was the pattern. The small ways people like Karen and Mike chipped away at someone's dignity, leaving wounds that were invisible but deep. Before Renee could rise, another voice interrupted the flow of the line. "Excuse me," an elderly white man said, his tone firm but polite. He stood with a cane, his expression marked by quiet frustration. "I've been waiting for assistance. Can someone help me?" Karen turned toward him, her face softening immediately. "Of course, sir," she said, her tone warm and accommodating. "Let me see your ticket." She moved swiftly, her demeanor shifting entirely. The man nodded, satisfied, as Karen arranged for a staff member to escort him to his gate. The contrast was striking, and this time, the murmur of passengers nearby grew louder. People exchanged glances, their expressions uncertain but aware. They saw what Renee saw now: the inconsistency, the quiet injustice. A younger black woman standing in line with a baby on her hip looked over at Renee, her eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment. There was something unspoken in that glance, a recognition of shared understanding. Renee offered her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement. Karen's voice broke the moment. "Next," she called, louder now, her irritation spilling over as she waved forward a white man in his 30s. He carried a briefcase and wore a tailored suit, his confidence evident in the way he approached the counter. "Good morning," Karen said, her tone almost saccharine. "How can I assist you today?" The man handed over his ticket, and Karen processed it quickly, her smile unwavering. "Everything looks perfect," she said brightly. "Enjoy your flight." Renee rose from her seat then, her movements deliberate. She approached the counter, her presence quiet but commanding. Karen noticed her immediately, her smile faltering. "Can I help you?" Karen asked, her tone clipped. "I'd like to confirm the status of my flight," Renee said evenly, her gaze steady. Karen sighed dramatically, her patience clearly frayed. "Like I told you before, you'll just have to wait. We're very busy." "And like I told you before," Renee replied, her voice calm but firm. "I've been waiting." Karen's eyes flickered to Mike, who avoided her gaze this time. There was a brief silence, heavy with unspoken tension, before Karen straightened her shoulders. "If you don't stop being difficult," Karen began, her tone rising, "I'll have security escort you out." Renee tilted her head slightly, her expression unflinching. "Security? For asking about my flight status?" Karen didn't respond immediately, her jaw tightening. Mike shifted uncomfortably beside her, his earlier confidence slipping further. The passengers in line behind Renee were watching now, their curiosity turning to quiet concern. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, low but unmistakable. Renee leaned in slightly, her voice low but firm. "You should consider how you treat people," she said. "You never know who might be watching." Karen's face reddened, her earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of Renee's words. Mike cleared his throat, but whatever he was about to say died in his throat as Renee's gaze swept over him. Without another word, Renee stepped aside, her posture impeccable, her composure unshaken. She returned to her bench, her movements deliberate as she sat and crossed her legs. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder now, a ripple of awareness spreading through the terminal. Karen and Mike exchanged a glance, their unease evident. The power they had wielded so casually all morning was slipping, and they didn't yet know how to reclaim it. Renee glanced at her watch. The hour was nearing, and she could feel the shift in the air. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface was rising now. threatening to spill over. But Renee wasn't just waiting for the moment to break. She was waiting to shape it. And when the time came, she would make sure that Karen, Mike, and everyone else in that terminal would see what true authority looked like, not the kind born of position or privilege, but the kind that demanded respect without ever raising its voice. The terminal pulsed with a familiar rhythm, luggage wheels clattering against the tile, voices blending into a dull roar, and overhead announcements echoing like distant thunder. Yet, beneath that surface hum, the tension at the counter had sharpened into something palpable. Renee Parker, seated near enough to see every detail, knew the moment was approaching when silence would no longer suffice. Karen Thompson and Mike Jacobs were unraveling, though they clung desperately to the illusion of control. Karen's commands grew sharper, her tone biting. Mike's once easy smirk now seemed forced, his eyes darting nervously between passengers. Another passenger approached the counter, a white man in his late 50s. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "Excuse me," he said, placing his ticket on the counter. "I was told my seat was confirmed, but now I'm being told it isn't. I need this resolved immediately." Karen softened at once, her voice taking on a practiced warmth. "I understand, sir. Let me see what I can do." She leaned into the screen, typing furiously, her body language deferential. Mike stepped closer, nodding along as though to reassure the man that his issue was of the utmost importance. Renee watched as the exchange unfolded, noting every detail, the tone, the posture, the stark contrast to how Karen had treated others only moments before. When the issue was resolved and the man walked away satisfied, Karen's demeanor shifted again. The next passenger, a young black woman with a baby in a stroller, approached hesitantly. "I need to gate check the stroller," the woman said softly. Karen sighed, her patience visibly fraying. "You'll have to fold it down and bring it back when you're ready," she said, barely looking up. The woman's brow furrowed. "But I need help folding it," she said, her voice tinged with desperation. "I have my hands full." "Next," Karen barked, cutting her off. The young mother stepped back, her face flushed with embarrassment, her hands fumbling with the stroller as the baby began to cry. Karen ignored her entirely, turning her attention to the next passenger. Renee's chest tightened. She stood, her movements deliberate as she walked toward the mother. "May I help you?" Renee asked gently. The woman looked up, startled, then nodded quickly. "Thank you," she whispered. Renee knelt, folding the stroller with practiced ease. She handed it to the woman with a small smile, her voice soft. "You're all set now." The mother's eyes glistened with gratitude. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice trembling. Karen glanced over, her expression unreadable. Mike shifted uncomfortably beside her, his gaze flickering toward Renee and then quickly away. As Renee returned to her seat, the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. The tension that had simmered all morning was beginning to boil over. And Karen could feel it. She slammed a hand on the counter, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. "If you don't have your tickets ready, step out of line," she snapped, her voice harsh and trembling with frustration. A collective silence fell over the terminal, the weight of her outburst hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions a mix of shock and disapproval. Renee leaned back in her seat, her gaze steady. Karen's mask was slipping, and the truth beneath it was laid bare for all to see. It wasn't just about Karen or Mike anymore. It was about a system that allowed this behavior to fester, unchecked and unchallenged. It was about the passengers who had endured it quietly, believing they had no choice but to accept it. And now, it was about Renee, who had chosen not to walk away. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen. A message from Mr. Bennett, the regional manager who was scheduled to meet her later that day. "On my way to the terminal. ETA 15 minutes. Ready for introductions?" Renee typed a quick response. "I'm ready." "They may not be." Sliding the phone back into her pocket, Renee rose again, this time walking toward the counter with a quiet determination. Karen's eyes widened as she approached, her earlier bravado crumbling into something closer to fear. "Yes?" Karen said, her voice clipped but unsteady. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," Renee said calmly. Karen blinked, her jaw tightening. "I am the supervisor," she said, her voice rising defensively. "Then I'd like to speak to your manager," Renee replied, her tone unwavering. Karen hesitated, her eyes darting to Mike, who looked away. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, a ripple of tension spreading through the crowd. "I don't have time for this," Karen said finally, her voice trembling with barely concealed anger. Renee tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "Make time." Before Karen could respond, a voice rang out from behind them. "Ms. Parker." Renee turned to see Mr. Bennett approaching, flanked by two assistants. His presence was commanding, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene. "Mr. Bennett," Renee said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of authority. Karen paled visibly, her earlier confidence dissolving entirely. "Mr. Bennett," she stammered, "I didn't realize." He held up a hand, silencing her. "We'll discuss this later," he said firmly, his attention now fully on Renee. Renee stepped forward, her posture poised, her voice steady. "I've been observing the team this morning," she said. "There's a lot we need to address." Mr. Bennett nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the counter, the staff, and the passengers who now watched intently. "Let's start now," he said. The moment hung heavy in the air, the weight of what had been and what was about to be pressing down on everyone in the terminal. And for the first time that morning, Renee felt the scales begin to tip. The terminal was no longer just a place of departure, it had become a stage. And every movement, every word, felt imbued with a weight that the morning's routines could no longer contain. Renee Parker stood next to Mr. Bennett, her calm presence an anchor amidst the swirling storm of unease at the counter. Karen Thompson and Mike Jacobs, who once commanded the space with casual arrogance, now seemed diminished, their authority eroded by a series of truths they could no longer ignore. Karen's voice, once sharp and commanding, faltered as she tried to regain control. "I wasn't aware of any issues," she stammered, looking between Renee and Mr. Bennett. Renee tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady but piercing. "Not aware?" she asked softly. Her voice didn't rise, yet it cut through the noise like a blade. "You weren't aware of the passengers you dismissed? The ones you belittled? The ones you ignored?" Karen's lips parted as though to respond, but no words came. Mike shuffled awkwardly, his hands in his pockets, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The earlier bravado he had shared with Karen had evaporated, leaving only a boyish unease that seemed entirely at odds with the role he had played. "You've both made choices today," Renee continued, her voice firm but measured. "Choices to uphold a system that thrives on dividing people. A system that feeds on assumptions and reinforces them with silence. Do you understand the consequences of those choices?" Karen flushed, her earlier pallor replaced with indignation. "I've done nothing wrong," she snapped, her voice trembling. "I've followed procedure." "Procedure," Renee repeated, the word heavy with irony. "Is that what you call the way you dismissed the young mother with her baby? Or the man who dared to travel first class in a hoodie? Or the elderly woman you left to fend for herself?" Karen's jaw clenched, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. She looked to Mr. Bennett for support, but his expression was unreadable, his silence damning. The tension in the terminal was electric now, the quiet hum of observation from passengers growing louder with each passing moment. People whispered to one another, their eyes darting between Renee, Karen, and Mr. Bennett. Renee turned her gaze to the staff behind the counter, her tone softening but still firm. "I've seen more here today than just the actions of two people," she said. "I've seen complicity and silence. I've seen people who know better, who want to do better, but who feel trapped in a system that punishes speaking out." Her eyes rested on Emily, the young woman who had spent the morning shrinking under Karen's shadow. Renee stepped closer to her, lowering her voice slightly. "Emily," she said gently, "do you think the way passengers have been treated today is right?" Emily froze, her face flushing as all eyes turned toward her. She glanced at Karen, whose glare was sharp enough to pierce steel, then at Mr. Bennett, who watched her with quiet expectancy. Finally, Emily looked at Renee, her hands trembling slightly. "No," she said softly. "It's not right." Karen's eyes widened. "Emily." Renee held up a hand, silencing her. "Thank you for your honesty," she said to Emily, her tone warm. "It takes courage to speak the truth, especially when it's uncomfortable." She turned back to the gathered staff and passengers, her voice carrying now, not just in volume but in weight. "This isn't just about one supervisor's behavior," Renee said. "It's about a culture A culture that allows prejudice to hide behind policy. A culture that excuses cruelty as efficiency. That culture stops now. Mr. Bennett stepped forward, his expression stern. "Karen, Mike," he said, his voice cutting through the tense air. "Effective immediately. You are both suspended pending a full review of today's events. Security will escort you off the premises." Karen gasped, her indignation turning to panic. "You can't be serious," she exclaimed. "I am," Mr. Bennett said firmly, "and I suggest you use the time to reflect on whether you want to be part of this team moving forward." Mike opened his mouth to protest but quickly shut it as a security officer approached. Karen's shoulders sagged as she gathered her things, her defiance finally giving way to resignation. As they were led away, the terminal seemed to exhale, the tension dissipating like a storm breaking. But Renee knew the work was far from over. She turned back to the staff, her gaze sweeping over them. "This is a turning point," she said, "not just for today, but for every day that follows. You have the power to shape what this place becomes. A place of fairness, respect, and dignity, or a place where silence allows injustice to thrive." Emily straightened slightly, her expression no longer marked by fear but by quiet determination. The other staff members exchanged glances, some nodding, their postures shifting as though a weight had been lifted. Renee stepped back, allowing the staff to return to their work. She watched as Emily handled the next passenger with confidence, her voice steady, her demeanor professional. The change was small, but it was real, and Renee knew it was just the beginning. As the passengers moved through the terminal, the whispers faded, replaced by a sense of quiet hope. The storm had passed, but its lessons remained, and Renee, standing tall amidst the shifting tide, knew this was the moment that would define not just the day, but the future of everyone who passed through these doors. The airport terminal seemed almost subdued in the wake of the morning's events, though the hum of activity carried on. Beneath the surface, however, tension lingered. It wasn't the sharp tension of confrontation anymore, but the quieter, deeper kind, the kind that comes when truths long ignored begin to surface. Renee Parker remained near the counter, her presence as commanding as it was calm. The terminal was hers now, not through force, but through the sheer power of her composure and the clarity of her authority. The staff, who had once seemed bound by Karen Thompson's dismissive leadership, moved with hesitation, but also with something new: purpose. Emily, the young employee who had once been overshadowed by Karen's harshness, was at the forefront of this change. Renee watched as Emily assisted an older black couple, her voice steady and kind. The couple smiled at her as they walked away, and Emily's shoulders straightened, her confidence visibly growing. But even as progress unfolded in small, quiet ways, Renee knew the deeper currents of the morning's events had yet to settle. Karen and Mike's abrupt departure had left a vacuum, one that still carried the weight of their influence. Renee turned to Mr. Bennett, the regional manager, who stood beside her with a notebook in hand. His expression was thoughtful, his earlier detachment replaced by something more engaged. "Thank you for staying," he said quietly, his voice almost lost beneath the terminal's noise. "I'm not here to observe anymore," Renee replied. "This is about more than today. It's about what happens tomorrow and the day after that." Mr. Bennett nodded. "You've made your point clear," he said, "but you've also raised a question we'll have to confront. Can this system change? Or are we just treating symptoms?" Renee looked at him, her gaze steady. "Systems don't change on their own," she said. "They're shaped by people, and people can change if they choose to." As they spoke, a commotion at the counter drew their attention. A white man in his 40s stood in front of Emily, his voice raised. "This is unacceptable," he shouted, slamming his hand on the counter. "I've been waiting for over an hour, and you're telling me I still don't have a seat?" Emily flinched but held her ground. "I understand your frustration, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the man's anger. "Let me check the system again for you." "That's not good enough," the man snapped. "I want a supervisor now." Before Renee could step forward, Emily straightened, meeting the man's gaze. "Sir," she said firmly, "I am handling your case to the best of my ability. If you allow me a moment, I'll find a solution for you." The man hesitated, surprised by Emily's composure. He muttered under his breath but stepped back, allowing her to continue. Renee felt a flicker of pride. Emily had found her voice. But it wasn't just her confidence that mattered. It was the way she stood her ground without losing her professionalism or respect for herself and the passenger. When Emily resolved the man's issue moments later, he left without another word, his earlier indignation replaced by quiet resignation. Emily exhaled deeply, glancing briefly at Renee, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. "It's moments like that," Renee said softly to Mr. Bennet, "that show the difference between authority and leadership. Emily is learning, but she can't learn in a system that discourages her from growing." Mr. Bennet's brow furrowed. "Karen wasn't the system," he said cautiously. "No," Renee agreed. "Karen was a product of it. A system that rewards power over empathy and prioritizes efficiency over humanity." The terminal lights flickered briefly, casting long shadows across the floor. Renee thought of the passengers who had passed through the lines that morning, the young mother struggling with her baby, the man in the hoodie who had been questioned for daring to sit in first class, the elderly woman who had been left to navigate her challenges alone. Each of them had encountered not just individuals, but the unspoken hierarchies and biases that shaped those interactions. And yet, there were moments of hope, too. Emily's quiet courage, the passengers who had begun to murmur their discontent, unwilling to let mistreatment pass unnoticed. "These small changes matter," Renee said finally, "but only if they lead to something larger. Today is a start, not a conclusion." Mr. Bennet looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "What would you have us do?" "Accountability," Renee said without hesitation. "For everyone, at every level." Karen and Mike were the most visible symptoms. But they weren't acting in isolation. Their behavior was tolerated because no one was watching or cared enough to intervene. She gestured toward Emily, who was now assisting a family with young children. "Give people like her the tools they need to lead, not just the technical skills, but the ability to navigate the complexities of human interactions. And create a space where those tools can be used without fear." Mr. Bennet nodded slowly. "We'll need your help to do that," he said. "You'll have it," Renee replied. As the afternoon wore on, the terminal settled into a new rhythm. The staff moved with more cohesion, the passengers with less hesitation. Renee saw glimpses of what this place could become, not perfect, but better. She stepped toward the exit, the sunlight outside casting long, golden rays across the terminal floor. For a moment, she paused, watching as Emily helped another passenger with quiet efficiency. Renee smiled faintly, her resolve firm. The work ahead would be long, but it was work worth doing. And as she stepped into the sunlight, she carried with her the certainty that even in the most entrenched spaces, change was possible, one moment, one choice, one person at a time.